All right, welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson, and I am your host. Our guest today is Ralph Hancock, professor of political science at Brigham Young University. We're going to talk about the mission of BYU. Is BYU accomplishing what it should be doing in following the mission that has been outlined to make it a unique university, or is it faltering? And if it is faltering, how do we move forward in order to accomplish the objectives and the vision that are in that mission statement for Brigham Young University? Before we get into that, Ralph, I wanted to start with the obvious news today of a few days ago, coming from the church in a statement on their support for the Respect for Marriage Act. What was your reaction to that? What are your thoughts on that their support for this? And it seems to be a break from where they've been before.
Well, I was not thrilled with the church's support. I certainly understand those who are troubled by it. It raises some grave questions about the church in relation to the world. On the other hand, it really does invite some very careful thinking about that question. And there needs to be not only a legal, but a political side, a very broad frame political side to our analysis of why the church is adopting the strategy that it is adopting in this case. So I altogether sympathize with those who are troubled about the church being ready to respect and shore up homosexual marriage. I'm going to keep putting that in quotation marks because I think it's fundamentally an abomination. It's really such a transformation that it portends the abolition of marriage as we know it. So that's where I'm coming from. But that's also the reality in which we live. The church is trying to find a way to accommodate itself to this reality and protect itself in the context of this political, social, moral, or immoral reality in which we live. So I altogether sympathize with those who are troubled by the church taking this step to assent, at least, to the shoring up of homosexual marriage. At the same time, let's not forget that the statement opens with the clearest possible, I don't have the wording in front of me, Greg, but the first statement is marriage is between a man and a woman, and that's not going to change. Isn't that substantially it? Yeah,
that's substantially the doctrine. The doctrine of marriage being between a man and woman is not changing.
So let's not, and that's in the present social and political environment, it's no small thing to lead with that flat statement. But that leaves us with the question, so how does that square with this willingness to support in the public realm what must be regarded, in light of what appears in that very first sentence, as an abomination? So how do you square that?
Yeah, and I think, for me, I look at it and I think that what is, and I believe this is President Oaks that is spearheading all of this, and I think what he's saying is the cultural war is lost, and there's no way we're going to be going back. He doesn't believe that we're going to be going back, and to fight against same-sex marriage, just like we did with Prop 8 in California, is a thing of the past. And so he's seceding the ground, trying to say this is not the hill we're going to die on, and there's another hill down the road, which is religious freedom. Now, some people are going to argue that that's not an issue, right? That the First Amendment is covered. There is no real threat to this at this time. Maybe President Oaks and the attorneys for the church see something different. I don't know. But I do think what you say is of particular interest here and imperative that as church members, we understand the difference between living in the world, which has its laws, and we live in a pluralistic society They're going to determine certain things. That doesn't mean that where we do support a pluralistic society, that doesn't mean that we agree with all of the laws that are out there. We don't agree with everything. And our doctrine is something separate from what the world is going to provide. What we have in the U.S. society and its legal system is not the same. One example I give often of this is, look, there's no law against adultery that I know of that's out there, but we're not out there organizing and trying to, support some laws that would come up saying that there's a punitive legal response to adultery out there. And yet that's our doctrine, right? But we keep those separate. Those are separate issues. We don't live in a theocracy. Yeah, so I think that's kind of where they're coming from on this. I think that's where they've gone to. The issue that I've seen in talking to many people is how involved do we become with the culture war, and are we really completely stepping back from this at this time? And is it the right thing?
Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, on the question of religious freedom being in danger, I'm completely on the side of course, religious freedom is in danger, and words on a page, even if we hold that page, the First Amendment, for example, sacred, and all decisions and adjudications following from that page, those words on the page will not protect us if religion is associated, if religion in any traditional sense involving traditional morality is considered as bigotry by a massive majority in our country. No words on any page are going to protect us. So my view is that in a country where, unless in our country religion is on the whole, or by some critical mass of people, thought to be a good thing, religious freedom will not be protected. It will be words on a page. So religious freedom is threatened. The question is, how do we negotiate the political forces and legal forces on the ground to shore up protections as long as possible, at least? How do we compromise and make the friends we will need to be on our side, given a direct threat to religious freedom, which cannot be long coming? And I think this tactical move by the church in the case of this legislation has to be understood in that framework. It's not the tactic that I would have thunk up, but I'm not in charge of thinking it up, and I'm not a prophet. And prophecy really is directly relevant here, because I've talked about the long and the short term. We're at a situation where we can't even think about these things without thinking like how much time is left, or what is the perspective in which we are operating. If we're just trying to keep our temples open long enough to welcome Christ at the second coming, and we are thinking maybe that's not so long, that's a whole different mentality from thinking that we are responsible for coming generations and coming centuries. It's a different kind of perspective. So that complicates our sense of what wise action is at the present.
Yeah, it's kind of like a track meet or a track run, right? If you're running the 800, you're going to put your biggest sprint at the very end. It's going to be a different tactic than you have when you're before that. Now, moving from that, you've got the church trying to maneuver, to strategize, to work within the shifting culture that we have. We have the same issue directly with BYU, where they're of the academic world, or they're in the academic world, but are supposed to not be of the academic world. And this is becoming more and more difficult, because as academia has kind of coalesced with massive support around certain principles, secular, faithless principles that are the culmination of certain ideologies and that those ideologies are governing in many cases many of the universities, the departments, the faculty members in academia. How is it possible with this intrusion from what I call the religion of academia? How is it possible for BYU to stay out of that if they still want to be a part of that? Right, because you have the statements like, what was it, the 90s? I think it was President Samuelson was, we want to be the Harvard of the West. Well, can you do that? Is that even possible? Is that a wrong move? Or how is it possible to stay out of the academia of the world at this point? Which is, we have in the church, we have the strong recommendation, the strong suggestion, maybe even doctrinal suggestion that we need to increase our knowledge and become educated. This is Brigham Young. That's why it's Brigham Young University. It's just this focus on education. But what do you do when education is now engrossed in attitudes and philosophies that are completely contrary to the gospel?
Well, it is a massive challenge. And the main point of my article recently published at square2.org about BYU and the problem of secularization, the challenge of a gospel methodology. My main point is to show how huge the challenge is. Now, the good news is, and I don't want to lose sight of this good news for a minute, the good news is that the present leadership of the university, and by leadership, I mean even more than the administration in Provo, the commissioner of education and people behind the commissioner of education, Elder Holland, Elder Christofferson, President Oakes, notably. The good news, from my point of view, is that these people share the concern that you just stated and are extremely aware of it. And Elder Gilbert, notably, has, if I may say, got his teeth into this problem like a bulldog. And there's no way he's letting go of it. Okay? The bad news is, you just mentioned a former president whose name I needn't repeat, but the bad news is we have been negligent of this problem or wholly complacent regarding the university's accommodation to the larger academic establishment for many decades. And so the whole institution is now massively entrenched. It has interests and incentives interlocking with a massive academic establishment. But before I go any further, don't take me to be saying that we can just divorce ourselves and, design a style all of our own, apart from any allies or any peers in the academic establishment. That can't happen. But our viewers need to understand that, my perspective and my mood on these matters is shaped by the fact that I've been there for 35 years, and I've heard a lot of talk about BYU's mission. And I think still there's no more, if I may say, no more substantial and positively directive statement on the university's mission than a talk Elder Holland gave, was it in 1988 or 89, A School in Zion, when he was president of BYU, and asked us to overcome the fragmentation and secularization, the loss of any sense of attention to the fundamental concerns of the human soul. Elder Holland's talk was as substantial and directive as can be. I was a new faculty member with dark brown curly hair at BYU, if I may say, at that time. And it was wonderful, and it made no difference.
What do you mean by it made no difference?
I just don't see that that's probably a little rash. There are probably other people who heard it like me, other faculty members, maybe some administrator somewhere who heard it and took some steps to implement it. Maybe honors in general education was somewhat more in some period long ago and far away, somewhat more oriented towards the great conversation available in liberal arts education than they would have been if they hadn't been buoyed up by that speech. But on the whole, actually, the university, not long after that time, went powerfully in completely the other direction. And that direction is one that can be captured by the name professionalization, which means essentially tightening our relationship with our secular peers, trying to become a Harvard of the West, linking our star ever more tightly with what is considered prestigious in the academy, with the secular academy's definition of professionalism. That has been that's been the story of BYU while I've been there in the last 3 decades. And now, and that means, by the way, I say this in my article, that a message like President Holland's, and behind it, a little more than a decade earlier, wasn't it? Maybe 15 years earlier, President Kimball's message, his second century address, which is now happily so heavily referenced at BYU, all that has been practically a dead letter. And in fact, the professionalization has, I don't know how you can interpret it, and I don't accuse people of wicked or faithless designs, but as a matter of fact, those who embraced professionalization uncritically, I don't know how we can see them as not completely turning their backs on the substance of what President Kimball and President Holland said decades ago.
Yeah, and what we're focusing on here is your essay. This is a masterful essay, 38 pages. It is called BYU and Secular Higher Education, the Challenge of a Gospel Methodology. We're going to get into that gospel methodology in a minute here. But so you've seen over 35 years this professionalization, this secularization, and yeah. It's obviously we want secular knowledge. That's part of the mission of BYU, is to bring that secular knowledge forward within, as you term it, bathed in the gospel principles. But we seem to have had the secularization grow and the bathing of the gospel principles kind of fading away. They're kind of falling on the wayside with some of the teaching there. I want to go over a quote here that you have in the article here that kind of brings this to light, because the difficulty that this is going to be without, to me, rash changes here. You say, it is too rarely considered by academics and intellectuals that the influence of authority on the pursuit of truth does not operate only on the religious side of the educational equation. It is important to reckon with the rather obvious fact that there is a secular academic establishment, a network of institutions, and a force field of professional prestige that necessarily exercises great influence over all universities, close quote. And that includes BYU. So, for the audience out there, I mean, imagine you're in the faculty at BYU. You're involved with organizations, professional organizations, educational organizations that you're a member of. You're receiving messaging from them. They have certain principles and guidelines that you're supposed to follow. And you turn around and are supposed to teach under those professional guidelines, those teaching guidelines, those philosophies.
They trained you. They they evaluate you. They represent the very measure by which you understand what it means to be a real scholar and excellent. Yes.
Yeah, you are essentially a citizen, so to speak, of those organizations. And those, oftentimes, it's very difficult to say, I'm going to divorce myself from these organizations. You can't really do that. But to be able to filter that and not have that rise above the gospel principles that you should be, wrapping yourself in as you're teaching at BYU, you're getting the emails, you're getting the newsletters from these organizations, you're involved with other organizations and groups that help facilitate your educational pursuits and academic rigor. How do you do this? I just don't see how you do this.
Well, let's come back to that question, but let me introduce what I think is an important clarification here, because some will find me too cautious, but I want to make it clear what I am indicting and what I'm not. And I want to keep this as far from a personal judgment on people's motive or degree of faith or not. There are good and bad people on all sides of everything. Let's just posit that at the outset. But I mean, in a way, the real problem is that good and faithful people, in my mind, are contributing unknowingly to this massive drift away from any conceivable operational implementation of a distinctive mission for BYU. The authority of this secular academic establishment can only be so great because, of course, it's been internalized. For the people who accept it and who are in it, this is just what it means to be a good, responsible scholar and a good literary critic, a good social scientist, or what have you, just following the steps of intellectual rigor and scholarly responsibility as we've been taught. So that's what it means to those people. And so I'm not accusing people. I'm trying to recall the language you used just now. I'm not. For the most part, our problem is not that there are people who see a disparity between the establishment and the gospel and pick the establishment. No, the problem is they don't see the disparity. And so here, let me introduce another distinction to make clear what I'm saying and what I'm not saying, because you referred to a kind of ideological, a pervasive ideological, what shall we say, a takeover of the secular academic establishment. Really, I think we need to divide this problem into two halves. And of course, they cannot but be interrelated, but they are distinct. So the most visible half, the most visible side of the problem is the patently ideological radicalism that, for you and me and many others, immediately smells antithetical to the church and to the gospel. Critical race theory, Black Lives Matter, the more outrageous forms of LGBT activism and so forth. That plainly ideological teaching and scholarship, I'm not saying it's not a problem. It is a problem, but in a way, it's the easier problem to address because it's plain and visible. But I argue in the article, it's really the tip of the iceberg, because the harder to tackle side of the problem is more the side that presents itself as neutral and professional and academic and scholarly and rigorous. You could say it's the problem of ideology on the one hand and the problem of science or rigorous scholarship on the other hand. Well, these have started to bleed more into each other than they used to, which is a sign of the times and a measure of the depth of the problem we face. Nonetheless, the more subtle problem and the harder one to tackle, and the more deep deep-seated problem, I would say, is, let's call it the problem of science, or the problem of professional methodologies, because these are the thought forms that are baked into the cake, and that those who are not in the business of criticizing the foundations of the disciplines in the social sciences or the humanities, leaving aside the natural sciences and the professional schools for now, but those who are working within the established methods of the social sciences and humanities are not routinely in the business of criticizing the origin and foundation of those methods. So they do not see that they're operating according to, at bottom, a vision of humanity, of what a human being is, that must finally be incompatible with the gospel. And so that's the deeper problem, which will require, I mean, how do you fix that? How do you retool completely? How does a faculty that's been massively recruited, promoted, rewarded, socialized according to one sense of what it means to be rigorous and scientific and scholarly, how do you bring such a cadre of professionals to question the very foundation of their professionalism? That's not going to happen overnight, to say the least.
Well, and something baked in there then in that professionalism seems to me a little bit of, not completely outright all the time, but a little bit of an antithetical stance directly to religion generally. And so if you're getting that in and it's baked in the cake, again, you
well, it can indeed be antithetical. You and I see that fundamentally at bottom, it is antithetical, but a common strategy for colleagues who are fundamentally committed to professionalism as they understand it, a common strategy, and it's not only scholars who do this, of course, is just to divide the brain into a religious and a rational half. Mm-hmm. And just imagine that, the methods that we use in our social science investigation are one thing that we use during the week as scholars, and then what we talk about in Sunday school is another part of our brain, or a whole different conceptual map. It's like I was just talking about this in class yesterday, so it comes readily to mind. It's like the two truths doctrine of the 13th century that Thomas Aquinas battled against, the idea that like a secular naturalistic Aristotle could be like the rational truth, but then the Bible and the church tradition could be its spiritual truth, and we'll just hold these two truths. Well, no, in the long run, which truth wins? The one that has public authority and institutional entrenchment. And what you're actually doing by working from the basis of those two truths, you are weakening testimonies, you are undermining, you're basically saying the gospel is irrational. And, you can believe it if you want to. It's your private right to believe it and practice it, but it's irrational. And as human beings, we cannot long accept the authority or the beauty, really, of what we regard as irrational.
And I think more and more the fruits of that, you see that in for example, papers that are published and books that are written, even within the circles of like Mormon studies, is there's just this little more than a tinge of this way is better, and that we feel is rational, and the spiritual knowledge over here, well, we'll kind of see how we fit this in over here. It's like Hugh Nibley, he used to do the exact opposite. He would take a faithful approach. He had, here's the spiritual truths. Here, we'll see how we can get the secular knowledge in here and fit this in. And this is what held the superior, where the balance was lifted up, more. And so we seem to have moved kind of the opposite that way. We're trying to fit the spiritual truths in to this rational, and I'm all for rationality, but it's.
Well, it claims to be rational or critical thinking and rigorous and so forth. Or as soon as you hear language such as, well, as a historian, we look at the development of Joseph Smith's thought in terms of what, like the magical sources that were available or the leading themes of the 19th century. I don't think any of that really explains very much, and the bit it explains doesn't trouble me, I'll say in passing. But you move from that. This is a great illustration of what I was saying about the two truths within Mormon studies. And this has been a factor at BYU, including at the Maxwell Institute, which would be another interesting theme about BYU. But within Mormon studies, including at BYU, we have seen this tendency to say, like, as a historian, things look this way. But of course, I'm not denying the faith. I'm just explaining things from the standpoint of rationality, which I identify with the historical method, which is really a method of historical relativism. There is no truth. There's just like what people thought in the 19th century, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So that's a good example of the subversiveness of this kind of two truths mentality, because the part identified with science or reason inevitably tends to swallow up, subordinate, undermine the truly religious part.
I want to shift over to earlier this year. There was, as you said, I mean, there are certain individuals there and those in charge at the highest levels of CES and Brigham Young University have started to make a lot of changes. We can see changes in hiring practices. There's filtering issues. There's questions that are different in hiring. There's a number of things that are going on where they're trying to make these changes. They understand that there is a real problem, and thank goodness there are several initiatives that are out there to make some changes. We'll see how well those work. They've got a very tall hill to climb here. But earlier this year, before the beginning of the semester here for the new school year, there was, I don't know what you call it, a conference or you had President Worthen and Elder Christopherson and others that spoke.
It's the annual university conference. Something in this form happens every August, the week before classes start.
Okay, and so in these talks with President Worthen and Elder Christopherson, there's again this focus pulling back over and over again, as they have been the last couple of years, this second century talk from President Kimball that was given in 1975. But there's a couple of different messages in there that I want you to kind of dissect for us here. One, there's this message that is, hey, we're all about the student, which I mean, just in my mind, when I originally hear that, I keep thinking about advertising, that just says, hey, this is all about you, Yeah. And so I don't really like that idea, because I don't think it's about the student. But
it sounds like a public relations. It sounds like in the middle of a football game is what you say.
Yeah, exactly.
With students lying on the grass or hiking in the mountains.
Right. Yeah. So I'd like you to talk about that a little bit. And then I want you also to talk about Elder Christopherson. He goes in and he does another theme. He reiterates, in fact, this is the second time at BYU that he has talked about the two great commandments and the difference between, number one, loving God, and number two, loving your fellow man and your neighbor, right? And so can you just talk a little bit about those two and what your feelings are on that? You talk about this in the essay.
Well, let's talk about this. Yeah, there are two things closely connected: the strategy of focusing on the student and the problem of the relevance of the proper ordering of the two great commandments. Well, look, first of all, when President Worthen in this conference brought to our minds with pictures and a video our central obligation to the student as real people, individual persons, sons and daughters of Heavenly Father. Look, that's great. he was moved by that as he spoke. I was moved by that. That is moving and real. There is a good sense, obviously, of being student focused. And it can be the reason, this rhetoric of the student, and I don't use the term rhetoric dismissively, this persuasive talk about the student, is actually operationally relevant, because it can mean that we're focused on the student holistically. You hear this word used, and therefore upon what we as teachers share with our students in terms fundamentally of concern for our eternal well-being, the plan of salvation, our moral character, our covenant relationships, and so forth. So to the degree that focusing on the student means focusing on what we have in common as human beings and Latter-day Saints, that can only be good. But here's the problem. The way this focusing on the student works out, given the heavy presence of this professionalized disciplinary, departmental organization of teaching and scholarship, what tends to happen is that to focus on the student means to involve the student in my scientific or social scientific or literary critical research. In other words, make the student, recruit the student into my professional world. Which can be which is part of what mentoring consists in. If there some of my political science students or political philosophy students should become political philosophers if they have that talent and that vocation. And likewise for sociologists or literary critics or what have you. But you see that really reverses what should be the weight of the whole focus on the student. Focus on the student should call us away from our professional framing and our professional incentives and attachments to a broader focus on the student as an eternal human being. But this then goes directly to Elder Christofferson's emphasis upon the proper ordering of the two commandments. And to me, it's unmistakably important that he brought this up in the university conference address, and it's the same thing he talked about, wasn't it, in March at a devotional? In the spring anyway. And he even, he even humorously excuses himself a bit for quoting himself. But how can we not notice that here, again, in the context of the university's clear effort to realign with its mission, he once again highlights the importance of this religious truth. And so how can we not ask, I have to say, I haven't heard anyone else asking this, so I think I must ask it. How can we not ask, so what does this have to do with our mission at BYU? And can't we see that it relates precisely to the question of how we serve our students? Into what fold are we recruiting our students? What is the vision of well-being, or what is the purpose, the standpoint of purpose from which we focus our attention on the student? Or what is the standpoint from which we show our love for students as fellow sons and daughters of Heavenly Father? Elder Christofferson has told us in unmistakable terms, it seems to me, that we'll never get this right if we don't put it in the context of love for our Heavenly Father, of the specifically, may I say, vertical dimension of what is meaningful out to us as human beings, looking up to God, looking up to eternity, in the context of the plan of salvation, for example. If we think we're serving our students by making them better scientists or social scientists alone, that's what we're missing. That's the holistic perspective that we are missing. But let me add that those who, when we don't ignore the language of a holistic perspective, it tends to be watered down into, excuse me, but I almost might say just like being nice, reaching out, being compassionate, but all these terms which can be very good in a religious context also can be diverted completely in a secular direction. Just look at the language of allyship, right? So to be student focused, does it mean finally, I guess again, to go back to my earlier distinctions, to be student focused, it strikes me can have three main meanings: helping the students be little professional scholars to become like us, helping the students to, and this would be in the more ideological frame of reference, helping the students by validating their identity, however they name their identity today,
UBU.
by saying, yeah, UBU. And this language has been explicitly present in official meetings of BYU units.
Well, it seems to me like that the messaging is kind of this warm fuzzy. I mean, it is moving. It can be moving because overall the principle of caring for and having stewardship over the students, that's a beautiful thing, right? It's a big responsibility, and it's and to say that we're going to improve this is, or we're going to focus on this is the right thing, but there's no rock to stand on there.
There's no content or no substance. So that's
right. There's nothing underneath you to say, I'm standing on this. I mean, I'm holding up this principle, but why am I able to hold this principle up?
Yeah.
Well, because I'm standing on X, Y, Z here. I'm standing on something specific. So I recall, and I think President Worthen does a great job, and I'm not criticizing him directly. I'm just trying to dissect the couple of different messages here, but I think he had said in that talk, he went forward and he talked about, after he talked about it's all about the student, he put in there a short little film that had to do with a student that had professionally excelled and done real well. And that's great. And maybe you do include that in there. But when you're talking about it's all about the student, there's nothing in there that I saw that would support the idea of the mission of BYU, which on the other side of that, which is to help them improve eternally and to help them with their spiritual values. And that's the context there.
The student, and it is a lovely story, and who wouldn't be proud of this student? But the student had developed a new, a breed of grass that was particularly water efficient and would be good for, sports fields and other things. Well, that's a great little accomplishment. But why wouldn't it be a great accomplishment at Harvard or Stanford or the University of Michigan, right?
Right.
That's the whole question. And again, I think Elder Christofferson, if you juxtapose his talk with other edifying talks that we've heard about the university's lofty mission, you see a real opportunity to put some flesh on these bones and to give some content. So we've talked about the first two great commandments, mm-hmm. But in that same context, Elder Christofferson leans very hard on the notion of self-reliance, and going back to a talk from the 80s, or was it or 90s, from President Romney about self-reliance. Yes. And there you're looking for that rock to stand on, or I'm looking for that substance and that content. There, I mean, of course, he cannot spell out all the curricular implications of this notion, but what I propose in my article is, if you take this really seriously as a touchstone of our humanity under God, and think carefully about what this would mean for our teaching and scholarship, then the consequences would be quite revolutionary and would not at all sit well with the present professionalized establishment.
So also in this this conference, you had academic vice president Shane Reese give an address. He said a couple of things here. He talked about becoming new creatures. That's very good to hear. So if it's all about the student, well, maybe part of what is all about the student is that they're becoming new creatures. And then he said the following. I'm quoting this, or quoting your essay here. Reese called the prophets, and this is Spencer W. Kimball, the prophets' 1975 instruction that we would need in some significant ways to break with the educational establishment. President Oaks, at an address at BYU earlier this year, said the exact same thing, that we may need to break away from the academic establishment. He says, so again, significant ways to break with the educational establishment and braving the comfortable ethic of non-polarization. He went so far as to quote President Kimball's warning against pernicious atheistic influences, which is what we talk about a lot in this podcast, and his call for faculty to be sentries as well as teachers. Now, I'm very interested in the way that you worded this. You said he braved the comfortable ethic of non-polarization. In other words, he went against it, to go so far as to quote President Kimball in this. Isn't that a shame that you're having to conjure up this bravery, this courage to be able to say certain things? It brings to mind Elder Holland's talk in last year in 2021 in saying what he said, and you know why you have to have the bravery to do that, because I know secondhand, a lot of the response from the faculty to his talk, which was very negative, right? The response was very negative with some faculty members. And so to have the academic vice president go out on a limb a little bit on this, and yeah, it does require bravery. That's the environment, even at BYU.
Well, let's talk about the word polarization, or the concern with polarization, because this is in a way dovetails with the ethic of professionalization, because it allows us to, if the main problem we face is polarization, then really our concern should be just to be like good professionals and avoid the extremes. That's really, of course, we should be civil and reasonable and avoid vindictive or mendacious language in describing those we oppose and so forth. That, if I may say, is elementary. But there is a tendency, and it was a tendency in this university conference, notably, to to foreground the task of non-polarization as a key to embracing our mission. That kind of gets things upside down or backwards. But it's a great temptation.
You end up with let's focus on the student.
No, it's another form of rhetoric that allows us to avoid the momentous underlying problem. And this goes back to our opening discussion about the church's political tactics in relation to religious freedom and so forth. We want to draw every benefit we can from being at home in some mainstream and not being discredited by association with weirdos left or right. And if I may say, especially weirdos on the right. And look, since we're talking about this, of course, the Trump phenomenon it massively affects all kinds of, in every kind of way, our assessment of the political situation and what it means to be reasonable and what it means to be extreme. So, all of this would be a little simpler to sort out if there weren't the Trump specter on the right.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not going to attempt an evaluation of Trump and his influence or anything like that. But that really.
But of course, that makes it harder. But it's still underlying, whether Trump's around or not.
That's right.
That's still. I mean, you've got. Let's be honest. You've got. I think the last polls I saw, you've got. I think in the liberal arts colleges, I think it's about 90 to 92% of all faculty members lean to the left or are extremely on the left. When I say extreme, I mean Marxist, right? On the non-liberal arts colleges, I think it's in the 80s that lean to the left, to the extreme left. So you've got that's you're going to offend. You're going to offend if you go against any of that.
We don't have that data on BYU, do we?
No, I don't. I have not seen that on BYU.
Well, let's say that. I mean, it's likely that we're following those trends with a lag of a few years. Is always a good guess.
Sure.
Right. But yes, let me state the problem in connection with the ethic of non-polarization this way, that we have been called by President Kimball and by Vice President Reese, notably, and by Commissioner Gilbert, to, you could say, to be anti-establishment. Yeah, that's no exaggeration, to go against the mainstream, to be outliers. We must be anti-establishment. Trump is anti-establishment. Therefore, there's a risk, if we're anti-establishment, we'll be like Trump. Well, my view on that is deal with it. We can't, if we are so afraid of being associated with what is sometimes an unreasonable or crude attack on the establishment, if we're so afraid of being associated with that we drop back into a comfortable ethic of non-polarization, we're completely dropping the ball. And we are letting the left establishment define the terms of reasonable discourse and what counts as not polarizing. So, in a word, non-polarization is all too easily made a tool of the secular left.
All right. So in 1975, in the Second Century talk by Spencer W. Kimball, he talks about a gospel methodology that should be implemented and at Brigham Young University. There's questions about, well, what is a gospel methodology? And in fact, I think President Worthen says he doesn't know exactly what that means, a gospel methodology. What is, Vice President Reese talks about a gospel methodology also. What is President, because I think that this is really, that might be one of the most important phrases, if not the most important phrase in Spencer W. Kimball's talk, that is being used as an implementation tool now in the last year and a half to try and change things. But how would you articulate gospel methodology? What does that mean?
Well, in the article, I try to show how if we just take our bearings from what Elder Christofferson says and from a key, mostly ignored statement of President Kimball, we can actually begin to put flesh on these bones. We can actually see what it would mean to implement a gospel methodology. The statement from President Kimball is the one where he says, and this, nobody, as far as I know, pays attention to this part of the statement. He says something about, maybe you can find the quote from me, Greg, but he says something about forms of education that have served the university well for centuries. Well, there's, in other words, how can that not have something to do with the liberal arts understood traditionally as connected with the great conversation, good of the soul and the good of the city, going back, attempt to hold together Greek philosophy with the truths of the Bible. I don't have the solution to all those problems, but by referring us back to an ethic and a content of education that has served the university well for hundreds of years, President Kimball, like Elder Holland in his School in Zion address in the late 80s, is calling us back behind the scientific and ideological disciplines to some more fundamental questions and concerns. But let me add that, look, Vice President Reese's speech was the most edgy and substantive from BYU people in the university conference, including certainly anything that was heard at the university and the college and department levels. And he quoted parts of President Kimball's address that really have edge, such as, calling out the wickedness, the evil of secular ideologies, which is something that we hardly dare to talk about. And yet, Vice President Reese, like President Worthen, at some point throws up his hands and says, admittedly, I don't know what gospel methodology means. Well, let me talk about this admirable candor from our administration about not knowing what it means. Of course, in one sense, it's obvious and honest and good, because just how a gospel methodology would apply in all the various fields and areas of teaching and research, no one person can know all that. So a confession of humility is good, and a delegation of responsibility to flesh this out to departments makes all kinds of sense. On the other hand, if we really don't say anything about what it would mean, like it has to do with the gospel and it's a methodology, well, if we as a university can't say anything about that, excuse me, but we're hardly saying anything yet. And so really the point of my article is to say, we need to say a little more than that. And Elder Christofferson did, if you think through it and apply it directly to this problem of a gospel methodology.
Yeah, one of the things because I have communication with several faculty members and see in all the BYU campuses, and that's the one thing is that, and I think it's changing a little bit. I think some of these talks actually they do fall on a lot of deaf ears, I think, but I think for those that have ears to listen but have not had a mouth to speak, that is the one thing I think where we do see change from a number of these talks is I think that they're becoming, people that are in faculty positions with the students are having a little bit more feeling of being, the ability to be bold, to speak out against some of these things, because we don't do that enough. Right. And quite frankly, I wish the talks did a lot more. They used to, right? They used to talk a lot more about this. And this isn't about a culture war. This is about preaching the gospel. And to call out, atheistic, secular philosophies and ideologies that are pulling away a lot of young students today as they entice you with, false claims of compassion and support, and, like you said, allyship and different things. It's refreshing every once in a while to hear these things where there is a little bit of that being called out.
Yeah.
But I think we need to do it much more. We cannot. There is a phrase that was given by Marion G. Romney once, and then it was made into a talk by President Faust later on. The phrase is, trying to serve the Lord without offending the devil. Mm-hmm. And we seem to do that so much. And I don't mean just at BYU. It's almost like as members of the church, we're so happy that we feel like we've moved more into the mainstream somewhat. And at BYU, you might move that into, hey, we are just like Harvard. We are just like these other universities. And I can feel good about that type of belonging,
Yeah.
But we're not. And we shouldn't be. We should be a peculiar people, and we seem to be losing that peculiarity of being that people. And we don't need to please everyone. That's the wrong thing to do. We should focus on, it's not like you're trying to create contention, but if you are following the gospel principles, and we know that culture is moving further and further away from those principles, and you stand for something like Gordon B. Hinckley said, and you stand on those principles, there's going to be conflict that is going to come. And if there is no conflict, then you're not standing for anything.
Right. Well, that's exactly right. If there is no conflict, we're making no progress. Because look, given the massive entrenchment that I've described, how can there not be conflict? I've been inclined to say, how can there not be a train wreck? It's like, you have an irresistible force and an immovable object here. So, it's going to be some spectacular confrontation eventually. Look, there's a massive mainstream at BYU, completely pervaded by incentives that go contrary to any changes in the direction that we're talking about. Now, there are instances, friends have reported them to me, of colleagues who've actually said, who've actually seen this as a call to repentance and change. But again, maybe I'm one of little faith, but that strikes me as likely to be a rare way of moving forward. When people's fundamental interests, both material and symbolic, are touched, there's every chance that they're going to interpret everything, including the gospel in relation to higher education, in a way that is comfortable for their interests. So again, there will be conflict. And it was interesting that Elder Christofferson, I believe this was from his talk, or one recent talk of his, he actually reminded us that we must avoid contention, but lest we hear this as avoiding all polarization, he said, if we must contend, we must avoid being contentious. A very nice distinction, which is, we're going to need to contend. We must not let our temperament and our souls be affected by bitterness or a love of strife or unreasonableness, but we will need to contend.
Yeah. One thing I did hear from Elder Gilbert, who I've been very happy with what he's doing, is he brings in a very practical phrase, and he does show a contrast. And I think that's the most important thing with a lot of these ideologies, especially you're pulling out of religion or out of academia, is the ability to contrast the ideology, these ideas, with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so he said earlier this year in an address, he said, I'm paraphrasing, obviously, he said, we need to take DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, and understand that the world's DEI, the world's diversity and equity and inclusion, cannot be our diversity, equity, and inclusion. That we have a very different approach to these things. We're going to take a spiritual approach to what diversity means and equity means and what inclusion means. So he's saying we can't go along with what the world does with DEI. And DEI is something a little bit more popularly used in the corporate world, but it's also used oftentimes in academia, and you have a lot of offices. We call ours the Office of Belonging. A lot will have the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, or Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, which ends up becoming this overarching. I'm not going to say Stasi, but maybe I just did. But it's kind of this overarching filter that everything has to go through.
Once you bureaucratize like brotherly love,
yes,
and give people the power to enforce it, that may not be pretty,
Yeah. Yeah. So I do like that there's this distinction. And I do want to let people know there are some things happening on the back end that the church is doing and the brethren are doing to try and make some changes. Last point on this, Ralph, I want to talk about what is the path forward on this? I mean, taking the idea of gospel methodology, what is the path forward for BYU?
Well, I make an argument in my paper, and to be sure, it's not one that goes down to details of organization and implementation. But if we take Elder Christofferson's talk seriously, then the path forward, and President Kimball's reference to what has worked for centuries of education, of higher education in the West, then something like a reconnection with, I know the term is no longer familiar to everyone, but with the liberal arts, with the great books, with a tradition of thoughtful dialogue about the whole good of the human person and the place of reason and revelation in seeking that good. This, to me, is the royal road. This is the bridge. If each of the disciplines in the social science, in the humanities, can, let us say, bracket to some degree or put at arm's length the latest fads and disciplinary methodologies and reconnect using some old books, notably, like, I don't know, Aristotle, like Tocqueville, to raise these questions as thinkers and scholars and teachers, then this provides a bridge to a gospel methodology. This allows us to connect the fundamentals of the restoration with, in my case, for instance, the study of politics. So again, that's not an operationally ready program, but that's the general shape of the only solution that I can see. And it may sound, I don't know, to some listeners, it may sound minimalist or pretty general and ethereal, but to move even a single short step in this direction would be earth-shaking at BYU. You would have to stop a train already going 80 miles an hour in another direction and divert it in this direction, which will by no means be easy. But in terms of implementation, I do have to, on the positive end of the scale, on the encouraging end of the scale, there's a bit of breaking news that happened since I wrote my article, and that is a talk by a new vice president, Justin Collins, who came over from the law school. Justin gave a devotional a few months ago. Was it in the spring or summer? Must have been in the spring. Justin gave a devotional about BYU and its mission, if you want to know who Justin is. But he recently had a meeting with BYU leaders. I guess that would be department chairs and college administrations, I think. I wasn't there, but the text of his speech to them has been shared. And it is, if you think Vice President Reese had a little edge to his insistence on gospel methodology, this is definitely a huge step forward, a radical step forward. And Justin himself uses the language of radicality. He's saying, yeah, I'm going to propose some radical things here. I'm going to propose that we've done this professionalization thing, and that was good and necessary up to a point, but actually that's not our concern now. Actually, we need to back off that a bit and put more emphasis upon our distinctive mission, even at the cost. This is something radical to say at BYU, even at the cost of what would be considered professional prestige and what the establishment would define as professional standards. We have to go more in the direction of having our own standards and being confident in erecting and institutionalizing our own standards. So this was quite a momentous talk, and this associate vice president Collins works with Vice President Reese, so that's his place in the organization. But he really seems to have taken a big step forward in insisting, wouldn't be too strong a word, that colleges and departments find a way to articulate and to implement, to put teeth in the authority of a gospel methodology. Now, maybe I have less faith than Vice President Collins, but I'm still worried that this is still in the mode of exhorting and delegating to departments to put flesh on these bones. It's more insistent and definite than it has been. But I remain skeptical as to whether the present
leadership
power structure, because that's what it is, the present establishment can reconvert itself, can become something very different from what it is. As I argue in my article, I think some workarounds will finally be necessary rather than these exhortations, however pointed, to those who have come up through the present system and have excelled according to the present system.
Well, as an outsider, I concur on that.
Yeah.
Appreciate your time on all of this and discussing all these things. Very, very important issues with BYU. Now, you have an organization that you're involved with called Fathom the Good that creates curriculum for youth based on good principles, positive principles, principles of the founding of America as well. Tell us a little bit about the organization.
Fathom the Good is a project conceived by a former student of mine, Elizabeth Sexton, who has just been amazingly courageous and energetic and determined to bring some of the ideas you've heard me talk about on this program, the critique from the broad perspective of the whole tradition of Western political philosophy, that critique of contemporary ideologies and contemporary education. Elizabeth, a few years ago, conceived this idea of making this this teaching of mine and this manner of thought available to pre-university students, beginning with high school students. Later, we want to work on down to middle school and to the lower grades. So Fathom the Good is creating curriculum broadly in Western Civ and advanced reading and writing. It includes some debate. It would work it could fill a civic slot in a curriculum. I'm saying this, so it obviously doesn't include math and science, for example. It's broadly the social science and humanities part of a high school curriculum. And so far, we have a ninth grade curriculum that is for sale at our website, fathomthegood.com. And I've been a consultant to Elizabeth in producing this curriculum. And the 10th and 11th grades are practically ready to deliver, and we'll need to finish the 12th grade in the next few months. So that's what it is. It's essentially, think of it as a way of confronting the secular establishment in much the way we've been talking about, in a way that is accessible to your 9 through 12 for now student. It's a way of grounding them in a tradition that goes back behind the narrow secular progressivism that shapes so much of secondary education today, in order to gain confidence in higher standards, and standards that won't be undermined as soon as they step into a college classroom that is subversive of everything virtuous, lovely, of good report, and praiseworthy.
Yeah. Okay. Let me just give the audience here a couple taglines on the program here. It says, we give children wisdom against the world. We create confident thinkers. We create confident families. We create clarity amid confusion. So that's what the program's all about. That's located at fathomthegood.com. Ralph, as always, it's a pleasure. Thank you for your mind and for your efforts and all you've done consistently through the last few decades at BYU.
Thank you, Greg. And you're doing great work. It's great to have partners like you outside BYU who share the same concerns. And you do a great job of combining vigorous advocacy with very careful research and reasoning, and it's much appreciated.
Thank you very much.